I'm going to read Jeremy's bio. It's quite impressive. Jeremy Orr is the Director of Litigation and Advocacy Partnerships for Earthjustice, where he leads the organizational strategy for engaging and partnering with communities and other stakeholders. He has an extensive background in community organizing and lawyering around environmental and climate justice issues. He has served as the senior attorney at the NRDC in the Safe Water Initiative, the executive director of Mid-Michigan Environmental Action Council, an environmental justice attorney with the Transnational Environmental Law Clinic at Wayne State University Law School, as the executive director of Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, and as national director with the People's Climate Movement. He's a member of the EPA's National Environmental Justice Council, the Michigan Environmental Rules and the Rules Review Committee, and the state chairperson of Environmental and Climate Justice for the Michigan NAACP. Additionally, he serves as a professor of law at the Michigan State University College of Law and was named the 2022 Senior Fellow in Residence at the Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy at Boston College Law School. We are very excited to have Jeremy here with us from Detroit. Please help us welcome him to the stage.
Good evening. Can you all hear me okay? Good. Good evening. I'd like to start by saying, thank you to the U.S. Green Building Council of West Michigan, especially to Wendy, Allie, Morgan, Kayla, and Sharif for all the coordination of this year's annual party. And, thank you for including me in this party in such a meaningful way. And although I'm from Detroit as an environmentalist and an advocate, I'm a Michigander, right? And I never hesitate at the opportunity to take part in great work, happening anywhere in the state, especially here in West Michigan, where your contributions to the fields of environmental protection, sustainability, public health, law, engineering, and many other intersecting fields, are working to make our state a cleaner, safer, and healthier place to live, learn, and labor. The U.S. Green Building Council has a stated commitment to equity. It states, without social equity, our projects and our organizations cannot be truly sustainable. But to have an annual party with the theme of, creating an equitable future is still pretty significant. And I say this because it's easy to leave the work of social equity to other people. The work of equity is hard. I know it, and you all know it as well, especially in the field of environment and sustainability where injustice is systemic and long-standing. But you being here today, in this room, at this annual party, tonight shows that you're committed to combating inequity and willing to accept the challenge of doing that work. So thank you all for being here tonight. All right. And because of that, I consider it an honor, a great honor to have been invited to deliver this year's, keynote. So as I speak tonight, about how, we as professionals in the field can advance equity in our actual work, I intend to highlight three important ways in which we can do that. The first is educate ourselves and train our minds to better understand what social inequity is. Second, recognize, identify, and then call out inequity and injustice when we see it. And then the third, administer equity and justice in our own work. But in order to overcome inequity, we have to first define and understand it. And I'd like to start by talking about my own journey and how I learned to define and understand equity. So I'm from Detroit, as I mentioned. I grew up in a neighborhood that was transitioning from thriving to declining. My parents bought this house in the 1970s when the block was still inhabited by both black and white residents equally. But by the time I started elementary in the early 90s, the last of our white neighbors had moved away to the suburbs. So I essentially grew up on a block that was, 100% African American. And I grew up in a neighborhood where, surrounding every other block looked exactly like, my block. But what I remember most about watching the neighborhood decline, it wasn't the transience of neighbors and residents. It wasn't rises in crime, but it was the neglect of the city around basic services, right, to provide for basic services in our neighborhood and in our community. As that decline happened, trash pickup became erratic. They stopped plowing the streets when it snowed. When street lights burned out, they went months, if not years, without being replaced. When water mains broke, the streets flooded for days until the city came by and actually fixed it. And the city stopped maintaining two parks, like the only two parks within kind of walking distance of where I grew up at. One park had a huge hill where you could go, sledding in the wintertime, or, if you were feeling advantageous, like dangerously ride your bike down it, like really fast. It also had benches at the top, right, where you could just kind of sit at the top of this hill and overlook the rest of the park and watch all the other kids play. The other park had, a full basketball court, a playground with kind of playground equipment, and it had a large grass field, particularly for kids to play football in. So by the time I made it to middle school, both of these parks became like an environmental nuisance. The grass was no longer cut, or we're talking, you walk by vacant lots where the grass is up to your waist. This is how both the parks looked. It was rodent infested. The playground equipment was no longer maintained or fixed when it broke. And the city removed the basketball rims and kind of never really replaced them. And that stands out to me because I remember my parents eventually bought me and my two brothers those portable basketball rims that you can kind of move around on the wheels, and our house kind of became the house where you would come to play basketball in the neighborhood. And I can't quite say exactly what year this decline began, but I associate it with my friend Davey moving away. Right, Davey was my early childhood best friend, and Davey was white. Right, and Davey was part of the family that was the very last white family to move from our block. A family who my family is still very, very close with today. A family who I still give props for being the very last family to move from the neighborhood, because I feel like that deserves some sort of credit, right, to be the last family out. And I still affectionately call them the white version of the Orr family, or they call us the black version of the Baxter family. Right, and I say this because our parents were around the same age. They bought the houses and moved to that neighborhood around the exact same time. Believe it or not, they had 3 boys that were the exact same ages of me and my brothers. Right, they lived 2 houses down. Right, so it was uncanny. So this is a family we grew to be really close with. And Davey was my age, right? So Davey was, kind of who I grew up with, and that was my friend. And as a child, you never forget something like your best friend, moving away. For pretty obvious reasons. But for me, as an adult now, those memories also kind of include this marker of when, my neighborhood began to decline, because I can pinpoint, when my friend moved away. And I give this background to say that, I didn't really grow up with a love for the environment, right? I didn't grow up with a love for kind of green space and nature, because, by the time I was, 6 or 7 years old, I didn't have access to it, right? It was no longer available to me. And more than that, if anything, it felt like I was deprived of it intentionally, right, in hindsight. So when I look back, knowing what I know now, it's hard not to name that deprivation as an injustice in particular. And I wouldn't experience something like that again until I was in my mid-20s, and by then I was able to recognize it as what it is, which was an environmental injustice or an environmental inequity. So when I was 24, I took a job as a community organizer in Kalamazoo, Michigan. I was making more money than I'd ever seen in my entire life, $34,000 with no medical benefits, all right? So, but to this day, right, I still say that was probably the most favorite job I'd ever had, because I learned a lot and grew a lot as a person. I worked on meaningful issues from transportation, affordable housing, youth violence and drug prevention, criminal justice reform, education, immigration, voter engagement. But the organizing issue that kind of set me on the path to be the person that I am today was this environmental justice issue. I held this organizing job for a little over 3 years, and sometime between my second and third year, I got involved in this environmental issue that kind of cropped up kind of in that time frame that I'd moved to Kalamazoo and I'd been working there. And it was the cropping up of an old paper mill site turned to a landfill that used to produce carbon copy paper in the 20s, right, between the 20s and 1980s. And it was discovered, right, that this contaminated site, this site was contaminated in that, the contamination was contaminating the Kalamazoo River with PCBs, right, a cancer-causing toxin. That this watershed was a drinking source for over 400,000 residents throughout this region. And to give you an idea of how big this site was, it was about 89 acres, and at the time, about 70 of those were contaminated. So this was a pretty serious issue. But what made it so egregious to me was, one, the site was placed on the EPA Superfund site back in 1990, and they had been saying that the site was cleaned up for the most part, right? So we're talking, this is around 2010, the story I'm telling, but we're talking maybe 20 years ago that folks thought it had kind of been cleaned up to some extent or was being well maintained. The second thing that made this pretty egregious was the proximity of this site, right? It was in proximity to one of Kalamazoo's largest Hispanic and immigrant neighborhoods, as well as an area that had a large population of African American residents and other BIPOC residents. So as an organizer, we organized, right, to make our voices heard and hold decision makers accountable. An organization named the Kalamazoo River Cleanup Coalition was formed. It had already kind of formed and had got active, and the organization I worked for, organizing churches and residents, had joined that coalition and joined those efforts and launched a campaign called Clean Up, Not Cover Up. As our campaign gained momentum, we were able to get the government officials who are responsible for cleaning this place up to meet regularly about solutions. We were meeting with officials from EPA and Department of Environmental Quality and local elected and appointed officials over the environment. And it was during these meetings that I began to gain clarity on what kind of environmental injustice was and the long-term role that I wanted to play in addressing these types of injustices. There were two things that gave me clarity. The first thing was that, here we were trying to address, an issue that directly and disproportionately impacted people of color and let alone low-income residents, and yet the final decision makers could not have been less representative of the community that was actually impacted, by this issue. And this was kind of my first wake-up call, right? That there was a real need for, people that looked like me with similar backgrounds to work in this profession, this environmental profession in particular, to advocate and make space for others and create, space for a seat at the table for other marginalized communities. Second, it dawned on me that many residents had no idea what was actually happening in these meetings that we were having with these appointed and elected officials who were making decisions, and that included myself, right? And to be clear, I was in the room. I was at every single meeting, attentive and paying attention to what's going on, but yet I couldn't understand what was being said, right? There was the use of legal jargon and acronyms and these references to obscure environmental provisions and policies that I'd never even heard of, right? We're at the time they're talking about CERCLA and RECRA and NEPA and all of these things that nobody in the community really fully understood, and it was like they were speaking a foreign language. So by the time we would leave these meetings and look this stuff up and figure out what they were talking about and spend the next week preparing to talk about it when we came back to the next meeting, they would have moved on to some other topic, right? So a week later, we're ready to talk about this, and they're moving on to something else. And after this happened a few times, it kind of became clear to me that this was intentional, right? It was an intentional effort and a tactic to keep communities from engaging in a meaningful way. And I know in that moment, I felt helpless, but it was this experience of feeling this helplessness that drove me to say, not only do I want to be, an environmental, justice advocate and work on these issues of equity, but, I want to make sure that, I'm never in a room where I couldn't at least understand what's going on. And as a part of that, also made the commitment to making, my future work, accessible in a way that communities could understand and in ways that would always allow residents and community members and impacted communities to engage in the work like in a meaningful way. So after kind of doing some searching and figured out how I would enter this field, that's when I made this this decision that like kind of later that year to go to law school and study environmental and civil rights law and bring that skill set back to communities that needed it the most. And as we know, oftentimes these are predominantly communities of color and low-income communities. So we fast forward to now, and here I am, working on environmental and public health issues, and in partnership with communities, all over the state and all over the country for that matter, and it's affirming to get to share about that work with you all tonight. And I'll say that equity and justice continue to be at the center of my work, and it should be at the center of yours, because that's kind of one of the only ways that we overcome inequity. So what is kind of social inequity and injustice? Right, so it's when actions are taken that infringe upon a group's rights, marginalize their opportunities, or treat them unfairly. Right? So at the most basic level, inequity and injustice is lack of fairness and justice. But building on that definition, we also have the specific definition of environmental inequity in our field. More concretely, environmental inequities are the expression of an environmental burden that would be borne primarily by disadvantaged and or minority populations, or by territories suffering from a certain poverty and exclusion of these inhabitants. And of all the forms of injustice, right, I find environmental injustice to be among the most compelling and in need of priority attention, because our natural and our built environment that we live, work, and play in every day directly impacts our physical, mental, and emotional health and well-being, right? So even with these helpful definitions of inequity and injustice, right, we still have to do the work of identifying and calling out injustice on an everyday basis. And in our field, identifying injustice can be tricky, right? Because it's not as overt as other types of injustices that we see, right? And instead, right, injustices in our field are kind of carefully crafted and embedded, right, in local ordinances and in municipal codes, in administrative rules and legislation and laws. But if we're intentional about training ourselves to better understand the role of equity in our decision making, it becomes easier to identify that injustice kind of when it pops up. And when we do that properly, right, the question shifts from what is social inequity and injustice to what does it look like in practice, like in our work and out in the field. And from my experience, I can tell you that injustice in our field looks like redlining in housing and insurance sector. It looks like children of color having higher respiratory disease rates because they live closer to oil refineries and trash incinerators. It's communities of color having significantly more drinking water violations. It's Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Asian communities being more likely to live in communities that have lead service lines bringing water to their homes. It's 40,000 homes in Detroit getting shut off from water in one summer a few years back, which the United Nations declared a human rights crisis. And it's the Flint water crisis, right? It's when we really think about it and train our minds to look for it, it's not hard to identify these things, because this is what environmental kind of inequity looks like, and it's important that we label it as such. And I'll say this, to me, calling these injustices out is the hardest step in the fight for justice and equity. It's difficult because calling people out and calling out institutions on racism and sexism and classism and homophobia it's uncomfortable, right? It becomes very uncomfortable. It creates tension. And while there are people who thrive kind of in that conflict, I think most of us don't want to spend our days and energy fighting and being at odds with other people. But when something is important enough, we have to muster up the courage or capacity and energy to engage in this work in a meaningful way. I talked about how I got my start in community organizing, and one of these tenets of community organizing is understanding that relationships are built on shared values, but most people don't know what they value until that value is actually violated. So if you think about that for a second, have you ever had something said to you, right, or taken away from you that you really didn't realize you cared about until kind of like that very moment, right? And in that moment, whether you're angry or upset, and you couldn't figure out for the life of you why, that's because it was something that you actually valued. And it's likely that in that moment, you valued that thing enough to speak up and challenge, that violation or that violator. That moment, that you may be thinking about right now, and that energy you remember having in that moment, like that's the energy, we need to harness, calling out injustice in our personal and in our professional lives, because it's that energy and that passion that actually changes things for the better, in the work that we're engaged in. And I want to say, I often use this phrase, kind of calling people out. I said a few times, call people out, because sometimes it's necessary to actually call people out, sometimes. But it's also important to know, when instead to actually call people in. And ideally, you start with calling people in. I reserve kind of calling people out for heightened situations. I think the difference in those is, I kind of fiercely call out people who I believe are intentionally and overtly violating my values, whereas I call in people who I believe are violating my values unknowingly and unintentionally. And I think it's important, to have that distinction, especially in our field, right, where I genuinely and truly believe, all the work that's taking place and all the people doing, this work in our field are actually working to make our environment, a cleaner, healthier, and safer place. But nevertheless, right, it's still important, right, to recognize these, to recognize, identify, and expressly condemn injustice when we see it. And it makes it more likely that we'll approach our own work with that lens and that value of environmental equity, when we're able to recognize it and call it out. And because of the value of environmental equity, we understanding that value and understanding what that value of environmental equity means, that we can create a world in which no single group or community faces disadvantages in dealing with environmental hazards, disasters, or pollution. I want to best carry out these values in our work. We must understand this. Equity and justice walk in the room on our two legs. I first heard this phrase spoken some years ago by Monica Lewis-Patrick, the director of We the People of Detroit, a longtime activist and water warrior. She said it while speaking at a national convening on climate and environmental justice. There were folks from all over the country and really all over the world, who were in Detroit strategizing on how we could better implement various forms of justice and equity in our work. And there were some great learnings and great takeaways from this national conference. But I remember her saying that, like, more than anything else. It was kind of one of those rare moments where when an advocate kind of turned the attention inward and said, we, the folks in this room, we need to do the work of justice ourselves. Because oftentimes, we're trying to do the job of holding other people accountable, people who we deem to be kind of worse than us. And we forget that we also have the responsibility of not just talking the talk, but also we're responsible for walking the walk. And one of the best ways we can do that is by committing to what we call the Hermes principles. And now these kind of 6 principles are pretty important. And I feel like I said probably a few important things, but this is really important. These particular Hermes principles. So, story behind this: in December 1996, 40 people of color and white allies held a meeting in Hermes, New Mexico. It was a working group meeting on globalization and trade. This meeting was hosted by the Southwest Network for Environmental and Economic Justice, and it had the intention of creating some joint common understandings and agreements amongst participants. They came up with 6 principles known as the Hermes principles. And those principles have served as a North Star for many people who are centering equity and justice in their work, and in particular their environmental work, for the past 25 years or so. And those principles are as follows. Be inclusive, emphasize bottom-up organizing, let people speak for themselves, work together in solidarity and mutuality, build just relationships among ourselves, and commit to self-transformation. Right? So it's these 6 things that we can do, right, on a regular basis. Right? You don't have to be an organizer. You don't have to be an activist. You don't have to be an elected or appointed official to commit to ensuring that, you know, these 6 principles are in your work. You know, and at the most basic level, you know, what these 6 principles are saying is, 1, you know, make sure that impacted communities are included in decision-making in a meaningful way. 2, make sure that the vulnerable communities are at the center of your work. 3, you know, let these same people and communities tell their own stories. 4, commit to collaborating in ways that extend beyond mere support and actually include those issues in your work as if they were your own issues. 5, build real relationships rooted in respect and shared values. And 6, you know, do the difficult work of looking inward and making the changes necessary to see yourself as a member of a larger community that you are also responsible for helping change. Right? And that's what equity is. That's what social equity is at the most basic level. You know, and that's what it looks like in our work. You know, I often say that marginalized communities and oppressed communities don't need to be empowered. Right? They already have power. They don't need charity or community service or temporary fixes. You know, they seek justice and they seek equity and they seek to be included in our decision-making process. And we should be seeking, you know, justice and equity too in that same way, as I mentioned, in our work and in our lives on a daily basis. You know, as leaders in our field, we have the opportunity to administer equity and justice in how we do our work and how we make decisions that impact people in communities. You know, as a lawyer, before kind of going to court, I always, you know, try to temper my expectations of my clients by saying, you know, look, I'm gonna do my best, right? But understand that I'm not the arbitrator of justice in this case, right? In court, it's a judge, or it's a jury, or it's literally an arbitrator, right? If you're arbitrating an issue, or even when like my friends call, right? And then they call about like relationship advice, right? And you know, they're having issues with their significant others, and you know, I start with the same way. Hey, you know, I'm not the arbitrator of justice, but you know, here's what I think. And honestly, I don't want to be the arbitrator of justice in any of my friends' relationships, and I'm sure, like, you guys don't either, right? So, but when it comes to justice and equity, like, I do consider myself to be one of the arbitrators and administrators of justice, because for me, there's no gray area there. You know, there's a very clear right and a very clear wrong, and I choose kind of every day to do what's right in my work as it relates to equity and justice. And tonight, right, I implore you all to do the same, right? And that means drawing a line in the sand and committing to the pursuit of equity and justice in your work moving forward. You know, and as I said at the beginning, it's not easy, you know, but it's necessary. And by educating ourselves, by, you know, calling out injustices, by doing our part to administer, you know, equity and justice in our own work, you know, we can achieve these goals of environmental and climate justice, of a just transition, of equitable sustainability and resilience in all of our communities. So as I close out, just want to leave you with the reminder that, you know, justice and equity, you know, walk in the room on your 2 legs. So thank you again to the U.S. Green Building Council of West Michigan for having me tonight.